Aside from my Jimmy Buffett Christmas CD, this is my favorite Christmas song. Mannheim Steamroller is awesome. We have a whole CD filled with their music. It's got a lot of drums in it, which I really appreciate. We'll finish off the chapter. Now, this video could get longer than you would like, but I'm going to soldier through this thing all the way to the end. And we're going to start with something that we saw in our movie the other day, Food Incorporated, and it concerns livestock management, and then we'll finish up with fish management. So here we go. Alright, we begin this part of chapter 11. It starts on page 300, and they talk about this acronym, CAFO. So you need to know this acronym, Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. Here's a nice picture of what a CAFO looks like. These pictures that we have of grazing our cattle on wonderful grasslands, that's nice. It happens. Lots of farmers still raise their cattle that way. But as we increasingly get into higher technologies and larger corporations buy into these industries, they're all about the bottom line. And why would you graze 100 cattle on many square miles of grasslands when you can find a way to be a little bit more scientific, add more chemicals into the mix, and grow thousands and thousands of head of cattle, all in a very, very enclosed and confined area. These enclosed and confined areas are called feedlots. And that's what that picture is. Now, when you've got all of these cows living so close together, you have to worry about infections and diseases. And that's why we have a very, very high usage of antibiotics for these cattle. Remember the old idea of density dependent and density independent factors? Well, when you're squeezing all these cows together, you've got to keep them healthy. So one way to do it is to just indiscriminately add antibiotics right in the food. Don't wait until you discover an infection. Just go ahead and give them the antibiotics anyway. It's as if you would take a pill every day just in case you might get strep throat sometime. Kind of crazy, not a very good practice, as you can imagine. In addition to that, notice there isn't a lot of space? Do you see a single porta potty? No, you don't. These cows are taking care of their business right where they're living. So waste disposal is a huge problem, as you might imagine. We saw in the video, this probably isn't dirt here. They're probably walking around in their own feces. A really bad problem. And in addition to that, all of that feces is sitting on ground, and it does rain. I don't see any roof up here. So it's going to rain, and that feces is going to seep its way through the soil and can end up running off, and it can end up seeping into the groundwater. Now, there is a solution to this problem, but again, it's up to you, the consumer, as so many of these issues are. Remember everything we talked about concerning agriculture and buying from local farms and things like that. Same idea here. You can purchase in your grocery store the typical old beef and chicken and pork, and you don't know where it's come from. You don't know if it's come from one of these places or not. Or you can buy something called free range. With free range meats, once again, they're guaranteeing that the chicken and the cow has been treated properly, that they have been gone through all the normal life experiences that you would expect, instead of trying to fatten them up in such a short period of time just to get them to market. Instead, they're allowed to roam free. So when you see this free range idea, think of them home on the range. Think of them out in the grasslands. The chickens clucking away happily, and same thing with the beef. They're just grazing in the fields. So that's free range, and that's our solution to CAFOs. Alright, let's talk about fish now. There's a lot of issues to talk about when it comes to fish, mainly because you haven't experienced very many of them. Let's start with some definitions. What is a fishery? A fishery is a commercially harvestable population of fish in a particular ecological region. So a fishery does not have to be some small enclosed area. And in fact, you'll hear scientists talk about the North Atlantic fishery, where they're talking about thousands of square miles of ocean, but it's considered a fishery because it's a place where we go. It's commercially harvestable, and where we go to get a lot of our fish. Once again, because of the introduction of so much technology, what used to be a simple job, men going out on ships and maybe throwing some nets once in a while, we see something way different in today's technology. The use of sonar, the use of satellites, all sorts of different devices that are used to optimize your catchability while you're out on these waters. Because we've done such a great job with technology, it's hurt the fishing industry to the point where now a boat that used to just get a few hundred pounds gets a few thousand pounds of fish, and we have something called a fishery collapse. And just like the name implies, with a collapse, what happens is the place gets completely overfished. That is to say, we go way past that maximum sustainable yield, and we end up with practically no fish at all to catch. Of course, this is not the brightest approach if you're a fisherman. If you're a fisherman, you want to leave some fish behind so that they can reproduce, have babies, and you have a livelihood for a long period of time and not just 1 year. This is a very important environmental term that gets used. I'll bet you've never heard it before. It's called bycatch. And bycatch is all of the fish that you catch by mistake. With the use of all of these fancy nets, we're going to go over those fancy nets in a minute. With all of these fancy nets, fishermen are indiscriminately catching anything that gets in the way of these nets. And they're happy to. They pull them all up with their big winches and dump out what's in the net and throw back all of the fish that they don't need. If they're out there fishing for shrimp, they'll scrape the bottom looking for shrimp. They'll catch all sorts of other stuff and throw that bycatch back in. The problem is a lot of those organisms are dead from the process way before they ever get thrown back in. So that's the idea of bycatch. The most profitable ways to fish, unfortunately, use all sorts of different nets, different techniques, and they all increase the amount of bycatch. So you're no longer just catching what it is you're fishing for, but you're catching and destroying all sorts of organisms that you didn't even care to catch in the first place. And I'll talk more about ITQs on the next slide when we talk about what the solutions are. This diagram here is showing you global fish production. This is showing the commercial salmon harvest in Alaska. Sorry about that. This is showing the commercial harvest in Alaska, and you can see they had a big downturn here in the 1970s, and then they started a big effort to help improve the salmon situation. We'll talk about that again on the next slide. And now the numbers of salmon in the Atlantic are considerably higher. This graph here is showing you the fishery collapse in the Atlantic before any sort of action was taken to help save the day. So you can see they're not catching very many fish going here into the future, and all of this is because of, this is a great graph to show you what a fishery collapse looks like. You know, sometimes it happens rather suddenly, but sometimes not. You can see over a period of a decade or 2 decades, you see a decline, but it kind of sneaks up on you. Nobody's really paying attention. Well, we now do pay attention ever since, as you know, around 1970, we started paying attention to environmental concerns. We've improved, we've found some solutions, but this is a great example of what a fishery collapse looks like. Okay, let's do some videos here.
Commercial fish harvesting has become a high-tech industry with the use of sonar and spotter aircraft to find concentrations of fish. Several different methods are then used for harvesting the fish, depending on the type of fish desired. Some species of fish, such as tuna and mackerel, are mostly surface-dwelling or pelagic. Others, such as cod and haddock, are mostly bottom-dwelling or demersal. Shellfish, such as shrimp, are also bottom-dwelling. A fishing method used to catch demersal fish and shellfish is known as trawling. A funnel-shaped net is dragged along the ocean bottom, scraping up everything in its path. Unfortunately, this method catches unwanted fish, seals, and turtles known as bycatch, that are discarded, usually dead or dying. Some pelagic fish travel in large groups or schools. They are often caught by the purse seine method. The school is surrounded by a large net which closes like a drawstring purse, trapping the fish. Surface swimming dolphins are also caught and killed by the net. One of the deadliest methods for fish harvesting is the drift net method. A long net, sometimes tens of kilometers long, is hung just below the surface. Almost any sea creature that comes in contact with the net becomes entangled. This method can lead to overfishing and involve large numbers of bycatch. An alternative to harvesting fish in the wild is known as fish farming. Fish or shellfish are raised in floating cages or fenced-in areas in coastal lagoons or estuaries. They are then harvested when they reach commercial maturity. The method requires high inputs of feed, though, and can result in pollution problems due to concentrated outputs of waste.
More on fish farming right at the very end of the chapter. It's called aquaculture.
Humans have relied on food from the sea for thousands of years. Indeed, while fish make up less than 2% of human food, they account for 20 to 30% of all the protein consumed in much of Africa and Asia. This protein makes a difference between life and death for literally tens of millions of people. However, in the last several hundred years, we've become extremely good at catching fish and not very good at managing those populations we're exploiting. The tuna clipper behind me is an excellent example of technology applied to fishing in ways that results in massive overfishing. This boat, using satellite technology and a spotter aircraft, is capable of taking in a year more fish than entire nations took 100 years ago. The results of this efficiency are both predictable and unfortunate. Looking at this chart, it's easy to see the same pattern of overfishing being repeated over and over again during the past 150 years. In each case, the fishery was discovered, it was exploited, it was overexploited, the populations crashed, the species became economically extinct, and we moved on to a new resource. While this chart shows only 5 species, we easily could add another 50 to 100 species to this chart. The patterns would be the same. Many of the most desirable and important food fish, including cod, swordfish, and orange roughy, have experienced exactly the same pattern of use and overuse. When these populations disappear, one of the problems is that they're replaced by species that are less desirable and often not even wanted by humans. As fishing becomes more mechanized, boats more specialized, in many cases, the species not targeted by the industry are returned to the ocean as bycatch. Bycatch is often called bykill because these species returned are almost invariably dead by the time they get back to the water. Bykill includes birds, mammals, turtles, fishes, and invertebrates. This is especially important in industries that are not very discriminating about the way in which they capture their food. Shrimp trawling is especially bad in this regard because shrimpers trawl the bottom using a large net that simply takes every single thing in the bottom and brings it into the net. When the net's brought aboard, everything except the shrimp are discarded. For every pound of shrimp we eat, 5 pounds of turtles, fish, and invertebrates are discarded dead on the bottom. Removing large numbers of individuals of any species changes the ecosystem. Recently, we've begun to learn just how profound those changes could be. For example, in the tropical areas of the world where coral reefs predominate, herbivores make up an important part of that community. Parrotfishes and sea urchins graze on the algae which otherwise can overgrow coral reefs. When these fishes and invertebrates are removed, the results are somewhat catastrophic. If the herbivore is gone, the algae is able to overgrow the coral, and what was once a healthy coral reef is now a mixture of dead coral overgrown with algae. The result is much less than what we'd want to have. We have whole groups of fishes that have to leave, groups of invertebrates that can no longer make their living there. The result is a highly changed ecosystem that's much less amenable to humans. We are in the process of overexploiting and changing the marine environment in ways which result in unpredictable and undesirable effects. We desperately need policies, laws, and management strategies that will allow us to use those resources we need in ways that will not diminish those resources over time.
Okay, good segue, because that's what we're going to talk about now, what some of our solutions are. And one of those solutions is more sustainable fishing. More sustainable fishing works out by instituting fishery management plans. These plans oftentimes need to be international because, as you know, there's no real borders in the ocean. And so we end up with people overfishing from one country, even if another country puts some sort of safeguards in place. So that's got to be worked out by multiple countries. One of the first overfishing examples that ever existed was the whaling industry back in the early 1900s. In the Pacific, all the countries in the Pacific were hunting whales. Whales were a great thing to catch. You could use every part of the whale. You could use the blubber, you could use the skin. You could use the oil, of course. A lot of people used whale oil to burn in their lanterns so they could have light at night. And of course, whales were also eaten. So just about every part of the whale, even the bones, was usable. So it was a great catch if you went out there and you got a whale. Well, because it was so profitable, if you caught a whale or two, you had your family set for a whole year. Because that was so, the people got greedy and started catching way more whales than they ever needed, but they were trying to make more and more money. And so all of the Pacific countries over in Asia and here with Canada and the United States and even down into South America, we had a big whaling problem. Well, we ended up with a moratorium on whaling, and the moratorium on whaling still exists to this day. The Northwestern Atlantic was another example of an overfished situation that has been solved. Back in the 90s, it was discovered that fisheries were really depleted, and so Canada and the United States got together and put a moratorium on all salmon fishing. We also had laws that we passed. The Sustainable Fisheries Act of 1996 shifted fishery management from a focus on economics, in other words, managing the fishery just so that we could keep the industry going, to a focus on the species of fish themselves. So it was more conservation minded. Another example are these ITQs, individual transferable quotas. This worked in the Pacific with the Alaskan salmon, and it was really quite interesting because it works very similarly to cap and trade. In order to protect the salmon, individual fishermen, whether you were a corporation or whether you were an individual, could receive one of these individual transferable quotas. And that allowed you to do fishing just so much, whatever that amount was. And what that did was, first of all, it disincentivized big companies from going out and buying more boats and more expensive equipment to catch ever more salmon. They had a quota that they had to meet, and they could meet that quota with their existing fleet, and so that kept the numbers down. And then if you were a smaller fisherman and you could not possibly catch your quota, you could sell them. That was the transferable part of the quota. So you could make money even if you didn't catch fish, because you could sell your quota to somebody else. It's important to know that not all fisheries are declining, but it's very hard for you to know what the best fish are for you to eat. And so in order to deal with that, environmental groups have actually compiled a list of popular food fish and said whether they're a good choice or a bad choice. Some of the best choices right now, because of the ITQ process, is the Alaskan salmon. So they're high on the list. Good things to catch, good things to eat. And rainbow trout. Now rainbow trout are grown almost completely in aquaculture, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some of the worst choices, most endangered of the species when it comes to fishing, are shark and Chilean sea bass. You'll see Chilean sea bass on some menus of very, very expensive seafood restaurants. That would be something that you wouldn't want to purchase if you were environmentally conscious. Okay, one last slide. It has to do with aquaculture, or so-called fish farming. Just as the name implies, it's a controlled environment where harvesters grow the fish in a confined area inside of a net. You saw the video a few minutes ago. I kind of showed you what that is like. Aquaculture shows great promise, but there's been a lot of environmental complaints about that as well. First of all, one of the problems has to do with the fact that all of these fish, they're trapped. They're trapped in a net, and they're swimming around, but again, their feces builds up inside of the netted regions, so these fish are not considered to be quite as healthy. Antibiotics, once again, are used when they feed the fish in an attempt to keep them from gaining bacteria or viruses, things like that. Now, in order to operate this thing, they're always pumping fresh water in and pulling out the rancid water that the fish are living in. So there's always a movement of water, but what happens to that water that has a high concentration of feces, that's in this circle right here? That water is going to end up, over here or over here somewhere, and we're going to have an unbalanced ecosystem, and there's going to be damage to the fish populations in these areas. So that's one of the big cons to agriculture. Not unlike CAFOs. Same idea. These organisms that are meant to be running wild are trapped. So their feces, their diseases are quite concentrated. We also noticed that when it comes to salmon, for instance, that aquaculture salmon are not as pink and pretty to look at in the fish market as you would like. So one of the things that businessmen are doing, they're adding a pink coloring to the salmon meat before they put it out in the case for you to choose it and buy it and eat it. They just want to make it look prettier. For some reason, salmon just don't look quite as healthy when they're grown in aquaculture. Now, half of the shrimp and half of the salmon that you eat, that you buy, is grown in this way on fish farms. All of the catfish and trout that you eat at a restaurant is fish farmed. Aquaculture is very popular. You can see the numbers rising quite high because it is a popular way to go, and it does leave the fishery alone. So you don't have to worry about overfishing, but you've already heard the cons. I've mentioned them before. Notice the global fish production has pretty much kind of topped off, not going too much higher. That's because of all of these efforts that we're making in terms of laws being passed, international agreements to try to protect fisheries so that they don't get overfished. Okay, well that's it for chapter 11. The end of the line for this semester. I hope you've enjoyed this chapter, and make sure you take a lot of good notes because there will be questions about aquaculture on your exams. Bye for now.